Not all strategies are equal in fairness. In fact, some are just downright evil. It's why we have rules in competitive Pokemon. Anyone who thinks this goes against the spirit of the game is free to campaign for the unbanning of one-hit KO moves. Spoiler, it was tested in Gen 5 Ubers, and it turned the game into a complete nightmare, full of Kyogres clicking and praying that their sheer code would be the one to connect or connect first. Now, not every questionable strategy finds itself broken, either for a long time or potentially ever. Tiering status isn't the final word on the subject. Long before such things even come up for debate, the player base has often branded the more detested strategies with a black mark, proclaiming the strategy to be all sorts of things: skillless, cheesy, stupid, and generally things that would fall under the term evil or even toxic. These are strategies that undermine the silent contract of player interaction, which is assumed of competitive Pokemon. In their various guises, they take the game out of the players' hands more than any other strategy. We're going to explore such strategies today. Join us as we look into the top 5 most evil strategies of all time. Why are phasing moves named as such? Because in the days before oceans of entry hazards made a single force switch into a decently powerful offensive attack, Roar and Whirlwind were employed primarily to nullify the boost from something like a Cursed Snorlax or Growth Vaporeon. In this vein, they were like the boost removing move Haze, thus they were referred to as pseudo-hazing, then P-hazing for short, then combining it into phasing. Now, even back in GSC, where spikes were limited to one layer, it'd be too much for phasing moves to go first. It'd be too easy an answer to just about everything, especially in a metagame where Curse was so common. But it wouldn't just be related to Curse. Have a faster Pokemon against something they lose to? Doesn't matter, you just roar them out. Something like Roar Raikou is already renowned for its incredible slew of positive matchups against the metagame, and ability to act as one of the tier's most dangerous spike shufflers as a result. But imagine if it didn't have to run from even the likes of Marowak or Snorlax. You'd have way too many cases where you hoped it would exhaust its Roar PP. As a result, phasing moves have that negative priority that they're so well known for. Even when they began to do damage with Gen 5's Dragon Tail, the negative priority remained. Now, you could potentially get around this negative priority through Sleep Talk, post Gen 2 anyway, as a faster Sleep Talk using a phase move would still fail there. Gen 3 and on though, you could Sleep Talk a phasing move and it'd just be fine. This usually didn't make too much of a difference, because Pokemon running Rest, Sleep Talk, and a phasing move tended to be on the bulkier side and slower side, so you'd usually outspeed them. You'd occasionally get something like a Gen 3 Rest Talk Zapdos or a Gen 4 Rest Talk Gyarados, who were speed shuffling, as it was called, but they could only pull such tactics off against certain Pokemon. Most often, they'd be going second or using the move as the opponent switched, though there were, of course, instances of the move's great impact. This possibility did inspire some players to try and abuse this to the fullest, though, by using a Gen 3 Aerodactyl set with Rest, Sleep Talk, Roar, and Whirlwind. Once asleep, you had a 66% chance to phase the opponent first. Some players attempted to use even gimmickier Sleep Talk Whirlwind Crobat, as in, those were the only 2 moves that it would use, so you better hope the opponent brings a sleep move. Of course, these were unbelievably gimmicky Pokemon, not fit for serious play. Even the Rest Talk Roar Whirlwind Lugia briefly experimented with in Gen 4 Ubers, where it could actually wield Stealth Rock to hit Spike's immunities, was a gimmick, but the appetite for go first phasing was there. Enter Gen 5 and enter Liepard, who used the Prankster ability to some of the most devilish ends possible in Pokemon when combined with a usually ignored move, Assist. Calling a random move from your teammates is spectacularly unreliable, and so you're wondering, how are you supposed to get Assist reliably calling phasing moves when it could very well just call the Stealth Rock you need in order to make the speed shuffling work in the first place? Well, some of Pokemon's brightest minds worked around this limitation to bring about some of the most frightening cheese ever to appear in OU. All you needed was Stealth Rock to get the phase game going, and every team had rocks. So the Liepard team would use Ditto to copy the opponent's rocker and pop the rocks up without having to slot the move in on their own team. Further passive damage accentuating the rocks was provided by Abomasnow's Hail. The rest of the team was filled out by either the phasing moves Liepard would call or moves that Assist couldn't call, like Trick, Protect, Destiny Bond, and Focus Punch. So Ditto would copy the opposing rocks, then Liepard would get in and spam priority assist over and over and over until the entire opposing team was destroyed. But what about Magic Guard Reuniclus? Well, just phase everything else, and then Liepard would Nasty Plot and destroy Reuniclus with Stab Dark Pulse. It would run other moves on its own set after all. This strategy was a particularly dread-inducing form of cheese. All you could do was wait for Liepard to run out of assists and hope you survived the assault. And then there were versions that ran both Liepard and Purrloin, so that didn't quite work. Assist was so ridiculously cheesy, it was eventually banned from Black and White OU. Full stop. Starting in Gen 6, Assist could no longer call Roar or Whirlwind. Game Freak knew that they messed up. A relative of Liepard's was Copycat Riolu, which worked a little differently. It would get the first roar off itself, then it would use Copycat to call the last move used. And since Riolu had Prankster, its Copycat would be guaranteed to go immediately after Roar, thus allowing Riolu to spam priority Copycat Roar until it ran out of PP, also phasing entire teams to death. Gen 6 also changed Copycat to be unable to call Roar. Gen 2 is no stranger to a unique tiering approach, which was left over from a time where there was no such thing as tiering at all. Not in the way we've had suspect tests since Gen 4. Back then, there was just the intuition of the top players, and if that wasn't to your liking, you were invited to play somewhere else. That's why you had standard things like Snorlax not being banned, or Celebi being banned, and beyond simple Pokemon bans, how you got the unusual ban of Hidden Power Legends, where Raikou and Zapdos were not allowed to use Hidden Power through a combination of overwhelming effect on the meta and how difficult they were to legally obtain in-game. The Hidden Power Legends ban didn't last, but one nobody ever tried to argue against was the Sleep Perish Trap ban. Sleep Perish Trap was exactly what it sounded like, a Mischievous with Mean Look, Hypnosis, and Perish Song. Mean Look would trap you, and Hypnosis would sleep you, preventing you from phasing the Mischievous out, and thus being unable to escape the trap. Remember, Sleep Talk and phasing don't go together in Gen 2, or just generally preventing you from doing anything meaningful to it. Where this really became problematic though, is when Mischievous used Perish Song against the trapped, slept Pokemon. It would simply wait the first 2 turns, then switch out on the last turn of Perish Song, getting what was pretty much a free KO against the opponent, while it was itself free to come back in and do it again later, though once already tended to be too much. It's to no surprise why nobody would want that around. It was basically just fishing for freebies, and with good odds for success, given Mischievous typing and bulk, they gave it plenty of switching opportunities, such as against King Snorlax itself. It was a great Pokemon in general, with its utility sets being the most generally reliable for stall teams, but its Perish Song could potentially get out of hand even without Sleep in the picture. If you sent a non-phaser into Perish Trap Missy, it was almost certainly toast. However, this is where Sleep Trap entered the fray, to punish the fact that most initial responses to Mischievous would be phasers, since to do otherwise was needlessly risking giving the Perish Trapper a free KO. The phaser would switch into Missy, get Mean Looked, and get slept, and then what? Sure, it can't Perish Song with those moves, but it does have Ghost Curse, whose 25% damage per turn will wear you down incredibly fast, and you won't be in a position to do anything about it with the lengthy duration of Sleep in Gen 2. Missy can even take advantage of the 50% of its health that it loses while using Ghost Curse with a subsequent Pain Split, which not only heals it back up, but also wears you down and puts you that much closer to getting taken out by curse damage. And how are you going to avoid this? Go against one of the most critical fundamentals of Gen 2 by switching to a Sleep Talker first and get yourself routed by the most routine Perish Trap Mischievous? Mischievous wasn't even the only Sleep Trap abuser either. Smeargle was also brutally devastating with the strategy. Dealing with Agility Baton Pass Smeargle was already a mess of Sleep Talkers and phasers, but with Spiderweb in the mix, it got even nastier, potentially even worse with its capacity to pass the trap to something far more game-breaking, like Curse Snorlax, only you can't switch out against it. If you didn't know what set it was running, you were in trouble, and even if you did, whether you could actually handle it was still another story. It was a nasty tale of matchup, guesswork, and luck. The power of Sleep Trap was such on both Missy and Smeargle that eventually, the player base took a vote and overwhelmingly voted to hit Sleep Trap with the Ban Hammer. Sleep and trapping are contentious mechanics in isolation, and when paired, tend to bring out the nasty worst in each other. Though don't worry, that is definitely not where Perish Trap's story ends, but we'll talk about that later. One of the earliest major in-person Pokemon tournaments, Journey Across America, or JAA, was full of this strategy straight out of Pokemon Coliseum, used by the renowned in-game trainer Codell, though definitely more optimized than the Chad Super Trader. It takes advantage of everything uniquely busted about Gen 3 mechanics regarding doubles and boom. First, if your opponent Pokemon faints, you don't wait until after the turn finishes to send out your next one. Rather, you have to send the next Pokemon in immediately, and the turn will continue to play out afterwards. The most absurd example comes comes how one can potentially lose 4 Pokemon in a single turn. Your opponent's first Pokemon uses Earthquake and KOs your first Pokemon. You send in a replacement. The Earthquake also KOs the other Pokemon you had out onto the field. You send your second replacement out, but your opponent still has a second Pokemon that hasn't attacked yet. As such, your 2 Pokemon that have newly hit the field, despite not having any opportunity to even select a move for themselves, are at a risk of getting wiped out. Exacerbating this is the fact that spread moves are not weakened in Gen 3. That means Earthquake, Self-Destruct, and Explosion are hitting both opponents for their full base power. And indeed, that's where our strategy of the hour comes in. Also remember that Explosion in the first 4 generations halves the opponent's defense upon use, effectively doubling its base power from 250 to 500, meaning that even most resists get sliced through with ease. And now you see why Gen 3 doubles is a landscape of insanity, revolving around everyone trying to leverage their own booms while attempting to dance around the opponents. Explosion means you'll lose 1 Pokemon, but are very likely to take out 2. And depending on your teammate, you might even be able to do something to the opposing Pokemon coming in before they have a chance to do anything at all, letting you really ride the wave to victory. Now, you are unlikely to get more than 2 KOs a turn, and with how the meta revolved around attempts to limit this strategy, even getting 2 would be quite an achievement already. But a successful boom often left an advantage for its user in other ways. For instance, Explosion, of course, hits its teammates as well, but that could play to one's advantage if one chose to have their teammates survive the boom through Endure, which would then activate a Select Berry and leave it primed to destroy the opponent's weakened team. The real way to devastate your opponent through boom, though, the one that truly lays this strategy's claim to being considered evil, was the combination of Dusclops and Snorlax. This strategy even got top 4 at Journey Across America. And it wasn't just that Dusclops was immune to Snorlax's Self-Destruct, which with Stab was stronger than any Explosion. And it wasn't even that Dusclops was also immune to opposing booms, as well as its access to Will-O-Wisp and Titanic Bulk that made it a massive pain for the physically emphasized exploders populating play. No, it was the fact that Clops also packed within its moveset Protect, which is generally good for doubles play of course, but also Imprison. This locked opponents out of their Protect, and when you can't Protect, not much is stopping Snorlax from getting that Self-Destruct off. Dusclops also often used Earthquake on its moveset, which extended Imprison's reach even further. It shut down Groudon's main stab to such incredibly effective extent that some Groudon just didn't run Earthquake, which is downright ridiculous. In fact, champion trainer Min Vale used a Groudon set without any ground stab at all. His set was Swords Dance, Body Slam, Aerial Ace, and Endure. Ultimately, Snorlax booming alongside Imprison Clops was the most optimized form of booming in Boom the metagame, and in many ways its final form. Or so you'd think. Eventually, this specific metagame continued to get played, as well as another Gen 3 doubles meta, the Orre Coliseum format, which is played at level 100 with no Ubers. In fact, JAA is basically the Ubers version of the Orre format, which by the way is a really cool meta that a lot of people love because of the Explosion and Earthquake power level, and if you're interested in playing it, links are in the description below. Regardless, across these doubles formats, players adapted in the eternal quest to find even more optimal ways to blow up. Many Pokemon such as Orre Coliseum metagame staples Zapdos and the Lati Twins began guarding themselves against Boom with Substitute, which could also be used consecutively more reliably. Alternatively, Zapdos could use Detect, not Protect, which wouldn't get locked out by Imprison either. There was also a rise in Gengar use, which combined Explosion immunity and Earthquake immunity for that matter, with an explosion of its own, and not just any explosion, it was a fast one. Speed tying with the Lati Twins, which meant you wouldn't be able to substitute against it reliably. Speaking of fast booms, in JAA, there was also the unique case of Self-Destruct Mewtwo, and its involvement in a strategy called Obi Mode, which was its own form of evil. You paired Mewtwo with Endure Select Berry Smeargle. If played well, Mewtwo would blow up and likely reduce the opponent to their last 2 Pokemon while activating Smeargle's Select Berry. Mewtwo would then be replaced by a fast fake-out user like Jinx, Persian, or even Sneasel. One opposing Pokemon would get faked out by this poke, while the super fast Smeargle would spore the other. On the next turn, they would double up on the awake Pokemon. Smeargle would endeavor it to 1 HP, while the fast Pokemon then finished it off. And on the turn after that, they'd probably just win the game. Finally, there was another strategy that involved the pairing of Gengar and Choice Band Mewtwo. Mewtwo would instantly blow up, likely gaining at least 1 KO if not 2, while Gengar would remain unscathed. But the real kicker was that Gengar would use Swagger on its teammate slot and give a free +2 attack to the Lunberry Pokemon switching in, who was often Groudon. 2 KOs and a free Swords Dance for the incoming Groudon. Wow, Swagger is God even all the way back in 2005. So despite its age, there was seemingly no limit to the possibilities of evil in this format. Freeze Claws is not in any of the mainline games, but it is a long-standing tradition from Pokemon Stadium, and it's a necessary break from simulation of cartridge mechanics if you want to have a playable Gen 1 OU tier, at the very least. Unless you want to completely overhaul the oldest metagame by banning all freeze-inducing moves, which you absolutely have to, given how game-ending 2 freezes is. Seeing as that doesn't seem feasible, you accept that competitive Gen 1 as it is played on simulators is modded so that you can only freeze one Pokemon at a time. This seems acceptable in the name of fairness, as freeze fishing is already incredibly powerful. For example, a game where a Jinx sleeps something then freezes something else is already considered nigh unwinnable for the opponent. Imagine how absurd it'd be if Jinx's teammate Chansey was also free to go for freezes, as it does so effortlessly. Freeze Claws was carried over into Gen 2 despite the lack of permafreeze. After all, a 10% defrost rate is not particularly impressive, so why open the avenue for multiple freezes ruining games? Everyone was perfectly content with it. The rule continued for a few gens like this, but eventually was phased out. After all, more modern generations don't tend to have freezes flying around in general, let alone with the capacity for multiple in a game, so the break from cartridge mechanics was unnecessary. Take it out of everything as far back as Gen 3 even, where abilities like Natural Cure as well as an increased pace of play made freezes less of an issue than they had been early on. Freeze Claws was just as much of a part of the Gen 2 rule set as Sleep Claws, or Snorlax being legal. It was a part of the game from the earliest simulators, over to the more well-known Net Battle and Pokemon Online, and when tournament Gen 2 games were played on these sims, they were played with Freeze Claws active. However, when the default simulator became Pokemon Showdown, whoever was in charge of Gen 2, who certainly wasn't a Gen 2 player, decided that since it wasn't permafreeze Gen 1, Gen 2 didn't need a Freeze Claws and removed it without telling anyone. It actually took a while for any of the tournament player base to notice. After all, dual freezes were rare to come by, or so everyone thought, until there was a game where an experienced Gen 2 veteran lost to a player who barely knew Gen 2 mechanics because the latter scored 2 freezes in 3 turns. There was a discussion of the reinstatement of the Freeze Claws, and despite the circumstances of the rule's removal and many players wanting it, it was decided that Gen 2 would continue to be played without it. After all, you can thaw in this gen. Heck, you can potentially even thaw when switching in, unlike other gens where you have to make a move, and there's also Heal Bell. Plus, dual freeze is not likely at all. What's there to complain about? Well, yes, dual freezes are incredibly rare. That is, if you are not actively trying to get freezes, but this player base was newly fueled by irritations towards the removal of this rule and set out to score as many freezes as possible. Turns out, when you are trying to score multiple freezes per game, well, it's not so difficult at all. In fact, it's pretty easy. The Heal Bellers Miltank and Blissey are incredibly difficult to fit on teams, and in fact tend to be quite vulnerable to getting freeze fish themselves. The 10% thaw rate is indeed paltry. Most of all though, it was incredibly easy to go for freezes because so many of the tier's best Pokemon were able to do so, and it came from the excellence that is ice coverage. Gengar loves spamming Ice Punch, Nidoking loves spamming Ice Beam, Suicune started using Ice Beam over the generally superior Toxic just for the freeze potential. Vaporeon pulled a similar trick, even the Press for Slots Cloyster started fitting Ice Beam into its moveset more than it ever had before, and most of all, the rise of Gen 2 Jinx made going for freezes a game-to-game expectation. Many Jinx players utilize Ice Beam freezes as their primary strategy, and were consistently rewarded for doing so. The best part, these freeze fishers fit really easily together. The offensive trio of Nidoking, Gengar, and Jinx took over the metagame for how strong they were in general, not just for freeze maxing, although of course, they made it the easiest thing in the world, especially since they were just about always supported by Cloyster too. Even Snorlax started using Ice Beam, literally just for the freeze. Tournament games were overrun by the status, multiple freezes were seen with alarming regularity. As a result, eventually Freeze Claws was reinstated in Gen 2. The freeze fishing era wasn't over entirely, as Jinx and friends continued to fish for the status with alacrity, but at least they could only score one at a time now, as opposed to the previous truly dark age of a world without Freeze Claws. In gens with good offensive power, say 3 and onwards, Paralysis used to be considered the status you use just to slow the opponent down, so you can unleash a slow monster like Choice Specs Heatran or Choice Specs Dragonite on the opponent. That whole para thing was a side bonus, but this wasn't the comparatively offense-starved world of Gen 1 and 2, where you often had to rely on the free turns afforded by full para to break through difficult walls. Why rely on the lower odds of full para when you could just muscle through everything straight up? But that's just the thing. As a few crafty players noticed early, with the rest of the player base relatively soon to follow, those lower odds of full para weren't exactly low at all. In fact, 25% wasn't just good, it was really good. This wasn't exactly obscure, but previously, full-on abuse of full paralysis was reserved for all-out para spam teams, where the status would be combined with things like Iron Head Jirachi and Dynamic Punch Machamp for maximum impact. they had a sort of specification about them. This stuff is just for these kinds of teams, you see. But while dedicated Paraspam teams would go on to become one of the most infamous, detested playstyles, the fact was one didn't have to load up a million paralysis spreaders with a dedicated abuser to wrench incredible value out of the status. 25% is already quite high, more than a Tyranitar crunch drop, which is already not something to sneeze at, and the odds go up higher over time, right? Additionally, keep in mind that the higher power level, especially at the time during Gens 4, 5, and 6, that this full appreciation for the power of paralysis was developing. This higher power level didn't mean paralysis was less necessary, it meant one turn of paralysis was all the more impactful. Broadly speaking, you could fully paralyze multiple times with Raikou versus Zapdos in Gen 2 and be just fine. In fact, you might even appreciate the conservation of PP you'd get out of it. In the physical special split gens though, are you nuts? One crucial full para is enough to send the game spiraling with the level of power that's flying around. Multiple full paras when the screaming power of Choice Band Outrage is bearing down on you, it might not end the battle on the spot, but it sure gets you close. So all you need is that one turn of para. How do you fish for it? Substitute, of course. Facing a threatening Pokemon ready to chain together substitutes in search of that one full para is one of competitive Pokemon's most deeply unpleasant experiences, especially because the odds are actually quite decent for the sub spammer. Plus, once they get that sub off, they might very well get another full para afterwards, and then you're really toast, especially because these sub users might boost further, as in the case of Dragon Dance Gyarados, Calm Mind Suicune, or Quiver Dance Volcarona. Though Breloom is of course associated with sleep, its subset is a fantastic para abuser, because Poison Heal allows it to create many substitutes looking for the yellow magic. Or consider another grass type, Superior, who doesn't just glare you before going for sub, whose Leech Seed allows it to create many more subs, increasing its odds of not just beating your Pokemon, but doing so with a sub and contrary Leaf Storm boosted special attack, so it has no issue wiping out your follow-up too. Then of course, there are the sub users that bring their own secondary effects to the table. There are the aforementioned Jirachi, Machamp, and Gyarados, whose secondary effects are nasty enough even without sub or para in the mix. Machamp was even banned from Gen 4, but there was also the Sandvale monsters, Garchomp and Gliscor, heck even Cacturn, who helped get Sandvale banned in Gens 3 and 5, even Gligar in the case of Gen 3. Again, these Pokemon don't even need the assistance of Paralysis, but there is little more infuriating than staring down a Gliscor backed by Sand and Paralysis, whose plan is simply to spam Substitute until it gets a free one, and then to Swords Dance, and knowing it is actually favored to come out of the exchange with a sub and +2 attack in this carnival of odds. Oh yeah, this Paralysis and sub business works just fine when the attacks you're throwing at the aggressors are 100% accurate. Anything less though, and you'll often want to forfeit on the spot. Effectively, sub and Paralysis have the horrifying habit of being favored to end the game on the spot, all by simply waiting for and trusting in the yellow magic. The odds are actually so good, they leave you wondering, did I even get unlucky, or did I just get overpowered by the numbers? Shadow Tag is an ability of such comically overpowered proportions that Game Freak goes out of their way to give it to Pokemon that aren't good at all in their own right, like Wobbuffet and Gothitelle, and those still manage to become overpowered. They at least had the sense to never release the Shadow Tag Chandelure that had players losing their minds on day one of Black and White. However, in Gen 6, they decided to up the ante by giving Shadow Tag to a Mega Evolution. And not just any Mega Evolution, this is an ability that would have turned the bland, low-tiered Mega Autono into the terrifying scourge of OU, but no, Shadow Tag was given to a Mega that would have been a monster with just about any ability. Mega Gengar, with Cura White tier base special attack of 170 alongside incredible base 130 speed that turned the tables on so many Pokemon that normally check Gengar, like Scarf Tyranitar, Alakazam, Tornadus Therian, and Weavile, as well as Ghost Stab newly lacking a steel resistant and Poison Stab packing new purpose in its super effective hit against fairy types. Mega Gengar would have poised for success even if it had maintained Levitate and basically just been a much stronger, faster version of its base form. But with Shadow Tag, it was such a terror. It was even a controversial presence in Ubers before even Mega Rayquaza began the normalization of tearing action in the highest tier. Naturally, Mega Gengar began in OU, where it briefly destroyed all in sight before the format process of deciding its Uber stature placed it where it definitely couldn't have been placed immediately. But too much for Ubers? Well, Shadow Tag is such a monstrous ability that even Gothitelle was being abused to devastating effect, which contributed contributed significantly to the controversy around the ability. Ultimately though, Mega Gengar was the prime abuser of Shadow Tag that defined so much of Gen 6 and 7 Ubers, becoming one of the most elite Pokemon around alongside the likes of Xerneas and Primal Groudon. Getting one forced KO doesn't sound all that impressive, and indeed it's the kind of catchy sounding phrase that can easily downplay the impact of such an ability. So it gets one KO, big deal. You have 5 other Pokemon. Yeah, sure, when the options for taking on the enormous slew of high-powered Ubers are so limited, you can definitely afford to just let any old Pokemon go, right? Being able to deny the most fundamental aspect of competitive Pokemon, switching, leads to such controversial metagames because good players can take that one KO they're given and run with it easily, especially when tactics like switch moves put the opponent in truly awful positions. In X and Y Ubers, for example, you'd struggle to switch your Xerneas into Yveltal because the Yveltal could just U-turn into Mega Gengar and bam, there goes your Xerneas. When you can't switch your answer into the Pokemon it's there to answer, things tend to go bad real quick, and Mega Gengar was the ultimate architect of making things go bad on a game-losing scale. It forced the usage of otherwise inferior things like Shed Shell Blissey so as to not get completely ruined. And let's not forget how deep Mega Gengar's move pool was, letting it adapt itself to take out just about anything. With Destiny Bond, it often got 2 KOs, one that it forced and one against the Pokemon tasked with revenge killing it. This type of unavoidable 2-for-1, as well as Mega Gengar's general prowess with vicious status abusing Stab Hex and all manner of opponent denying tools like Taunt and especially Perish Song. It is the only Shadow Tagger to have Perish Song, and this is absolutely devastating because it can single-handedly start the Perish Song, stall you for a few turns with Substitute and or Protect, and then switch out for the free KO. This was especially excessive because, not requiring the move slot and turn of Mean Look, it meant Mega Gengar wasn't just trapping everything, it extended its reach of nigh guaranteed KOs to absurd levels. This was especially nasty in VGC formats where Mega Gengar was supported by a teammate, Gothitelle, who also has Shadow Tag. Not only did it create even greater difficulties in hitting it through Disable, a teammate could encore you into a VGC staple move like Fake Out or Protect, and you were utterly ruined. Complete Mega Gengar bait. In singles and VGC alike, Mega Gengar brought Peerless Evil to an already evil ability. This strategy has been used to win many regionals, mostly due to Gothitelle than Mega Gengar, as Gothitelle would continue to be used even after Gengar lost its Mega, but Mega Gengar was part of the regional winning team piloted by Wolf Click in 2015, and was a key piece to the strategy. And that's it. Of course, Pokemon leaves us with no shortage of strategies we could consider evil or toxic, regardless of how you spin it. We could have definitely mentioned Baton Pass, for example, while there are those out there who consider pretty much any recovery move to be beyond the bounds of the Geneva Convention. Let us know which strategies you personally find the most, let's say, morally dubious, and we might have to return to them in the future. Thanks for watching, everyone, and speaking of Baton Pass, we already did a pretty long video on it like a couple years ago, so if you want to know why that strategy is evil, be sure to check that out. And as always, if you liked the video and you want to see more, be sure to subscribe to False Swipe Gaming for more weekly Pokemon content. And thank you so much to our patrons for continued support of our videos. And thank you to everyone else watching as well. And thank you so much to our Platinum patrons. Thank you to Amphozenus, Alex Sable, Anthony Belval Renault, Bingleton, Daniel Isbeast, Funky, Glitcherton, Howl, Megamon VGC, Nurse Jake, Jack G, Pretzel SP, Spavoon, Skylaria, Soares and Croxon, Shiwei Miji, Stoneface Colin, Kiboflu for their major support of our videos. And follow my crew on these social media platforms. And that's all I got. See you next time, everyone.